There's a kind of pain that doesn't show up on tests, doesn't make noise in the streets, but slowly eats away inside. The pain of apologizing for existing, for speaking with conviction, for breathing differently, for having boundaries, for not always being able to be pleasant. A lot of people go through life feeling like they need to say sorry before they even open their mouth, as if simply taking up space is already an offense. And the strangest part is that this almost never comes from genuine humility. It almost always comes from fear. Fear of upsetting someone, fear of losing affection, fear of being rejected, fear of being seen as difficult, fear of being abandoned. Apologizing when it's genuine is one of the noblest expressions of being human. It's an act that repairs, that brings peace, that takes responsibility. But there's a silent distortion. The apology used as submission, as a bargaining chip, as an attempt to buy peace in relationships that offer no real peace at all. The person apologizes to lower tension, to avoid conflict, to not be criticized, to not face their own loneliness, to keep the other person comfortable, even if it costs their own dignity. And over time, this habit becomes an existential posture. If I shrink myself, maybe I'll be accepted. Honest human philosophy doesn't just teach you how to be good. It teaches you how to be whole. And being whole involves something difficult. Accepting that not everyone is going to like you once you start respecting yourself. There are people who got used to your chronic guilt, to your automatic availability, to your docility. And when you start speaking clearly, refusing what's unfair, protecting your time, they call that selfishness. Not because you became selfish, but because you stopped being controllable. The Stoics, with their soberness, noticed an essential dynamic early on. No one gets sick only because of what happens outside, but because of how they react inside. And one of the most common ways people hurt themselves internally is by handing their own center over to other people's approval. When you live dependent on applause, you become a slave to someone else's mood. And in that captivity, apologizing becomes a tool to reduce risk. You try to anticipate criticism, try to disarm the other person's anger, try to make sure the relationship stays storm-free. But there's a price. You gradually become someone who apologizes for their own firmness, for their own presence, for their own truth. Deep psychology has something important to say here too. A lot of people confuse being a good person with being a person without boundaries. They confuse kindness with self-abandonment. They confuse empathy with tolerance of disrespect. And then certain patterns emerge. The person apologizes for saying no, apologizes for needing rest, apologizes for not replying right away, apologizes for choosing silence, apologizes for not agreeing. That excess of apologies isn't a virtue, it's a symptom of a soul that learned love is conditional. I'm only accepted if I don't contradict. Notice how this shows up in everyday life. You're talking and mid-sentence you already throw in a sorry for no reason. You ask permission to express a simple need. You feel ashamed to ask for time. You feel guilty for not being available. You over-explain as if your decision needs to be authorized by the court of the world. And when someone is harsh with you, you look for a mistake in yourself to justify their behavior. That movement is subtle, but devastating. In trying to preserve the relationship, you sacrifice self-respect. And ironically, relationships that constantly demand this sacrifice rarely become healthy over time. They just become more addicted to your submission. There's also the other side, which is just as human. People who genuinely struggle to apologize when they're wrong. Pride, defensiveness, fear of looking weak. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the opposite. People who apologize even when they did the right thing, even when they did what was necessary, even when they acted with integrity. People who feel guilty for being adults. And over the years, that creates a kind of quiet sadness, a feeling that life is a walk where you need to ask permission at every step. When human philosophy looks deeply, it asks, what is the real purpose of an apology? If the goal is to repair actual harm, it's noble. If the goal is to avoid disapproval, it becomes an internal negotiation. I give up parts of myself so you won't reject me. And that negotiation doesn't end well. Because no one can betray themselves for very long without the shadow eventually collecting the bill. The shadow, in psychological language, is everything you push down in order to be accepted. Resentment grows there. Anger turns into acid. Joy becomes weak. The body starts complaining. And the person, without realizing it, begins to turn bitter and exhausted. Not because life was too cruel, but because they were cruel to themselves in the name of social peace. A mature person doesn't apologize for existing. They learn to distinguish guilt from responsibility. Guilt is a vague, sticky weight that makes you feel wrong even when you did nothing wrong. Responsibility is objective. I caused harm, I own it, and I repair it. You're sore. When you live in guilt, you live trying to purify your own image. When you live in responsibility, you live adjusting your own behavior. A healthy apology comes from responsibility. A sick apology comes from fear. And here's a delicate point. Many people were raised in environments where apologizing was the way to survive. Environments with emotional explosions, unpredictable punishments, conditional love. The child learns quickly. If I blame myself first, maybe the other person won't attack me as much. That child grows up and becomes an adult who jumps in ahead, who makes themselves smaller, who apologizes for breathing. That's why letting go of excessive apologizing isn't just a change in language. It's a change in internal structure. It's breaking an old pact with fear. It's saying, I can handle disapproval without abandoning myself. That doesn't mean becoming hard, arrogant, or insensitive. It means becoming honest. Honesty doesn't have the same texture as aggression. A person can be firm and respectful. They can disagree without humiliating. They can set a boundary without attacking. They can say no without guilt. They can acknowledge a mistake without destroying themselves. And that balance is rare precisely because it requires self-control, reflection, courage. It's easier to apologize for everything and stay accepted than to face the discomfort of upholding your own dignity in front of people who prefer you smaller. There's another aspect of human philosophy. Not all pain is your fault. Sometimes the other person gets frustrated because you didn't obey, didn't give in, didn't bend. Sometimes the other person gets angry because you chose yourself. And that's not proof that you did something wrong. It's just proof that the world doesn't revolve around other people's expectations. If every time someone else gets frustrated you apologize, you'll spend your life punishing yourself for something impossible, being the perfect person in everyone's mind. That's a prison. A wiser path is to learn to ask before apologizing. Did I actually do something unfair? Did I intentionally hurt someone? Did I break a clear agreement? Did I lie? Did I fail at something that was my responsibility? If the answer is yes, apologizing is moral strength. If the answer is no, maybe what you're feeling isn't remorse, maybe it's conditioning. And conditioning isn't healed with more submission, it's healed with awareness. What many people call being polite is sometimes just a sophisticated form of social fear. Politeness is respect. Social fear is self-censorship. Politeness acknowledges the other without denying yourself. Social fear acknowledges the other by canceling your own truth. A lifetime of unnecessary apologies makes you lose your own sense of measure. You stop knowing what's reasonable to expect, what's legitimate to feel, what's fair to refuse. You become an expert at avoiding friction, but terrible at living with wholeness. In the next points, the idea is to map out specific situations where apologizing tends to be a trap, and how to act maturely without falling into rudeness. Not to create cold people, but to strengthen the internal sense of justice. Because there's a kind of peace that's born when you stop begging for approval and start practicing self-respect. There's a type of apology that doesn't come from conscience but from anxiety. It shows up when you feel the vibe got weird, when someone makes a closed face, when the reply comes dry, when you sense tension in the air. You don't know exactly what you did, but you rush to fill the silence with a sorry. It's like trying to erase the discomfort before it turns into conflict. But when repeated many times, that gesture teaches a dangerous lesson to your own heart. Other people's peace matters more than my truth. That pattern usually forms in environments where harmony was fragile, where the household depended on someone's mood, where a small comment could turn into a storm, where the child learned that, to survive, they had to predict the wind and shape themselves to it. And then years later, the adult keeps doing the same thing, except now the enemy isn't the chaos of childhood anymore. It's the emotional memory of chaos. The person apologizes to avoid re-experiencing the wound. It's a defense. And like every defense, it makes sense, until the day it starts preventing life from growing. Human philosophy calls this confusing peace with submission. True peace is the fruit of inner order, not fear. Submission is an apparent peace that comes at a price. You shrink so the other person can feel comfortable. And when you shrink repeatedly, something inside you starts to harden. Resentment doesn't appear because you're bad. It appears because you betrayed yourself many times to avoid losing acceptance. And the heart, when betrayed, collects. It collects in the form of irritation, cynicism, impatience, coldness, or simply in the form of exhaustion. An exhaustion that can't be fixed with rest because it's not physical, it's moral. The Stoics had an uncompromising idea. No one harms you without your internal participation. That doesn't mean the other person isn't to blame when they're unfair. It means control over you only happens when you hand over your center. And excessive apologizing is one way of handing it over. You say sorry before you even know if you were wrong. You assume guilt to avoid facing the possibility that the other person is being unfair. You hurry to place yourself below because you believe that's how things go back to normal. Except normal, in these cases, is just the return of the pattern. You go quiet, the other person rules, the atmosphere feels fine, and you lose a little more of yourself. Some people use this mechanism against you consciously, others unconsciously. They don't need to accuse you directly. A sigh, punitive silence, a change in tone, a hint that you should have known is enough. And then you try to guess what happened. Rush to explain yourself, apologize for something you don't even understand, promise to improve without knowing what to improve. That's a form of emotional manipulation. And even when it's not intentional, it's still toxic. Because it turns the relationship into an invisible courtroom where you already enter guilty. The central point is simple. Apologizing is appropriate when there's a concrete action that hurts someone. But apologizing to remove tension from the environment is something else. It's an apology to fix the vibe, not to repair real harm. And the problem with fixing the vibe is that you start taking responsibility for the other person's emotional state. You become the firefighter for fires you didn't start. And that's an impossible burden. How does this show up in real life? You set a simple boundary. For example, you say you can't go to a hangout, can't lend money, can't solve something right now. And instead of holding the boundary calmly, you feel guilty. And then comes the sequence. Sorry, I know it's annoying. Really sorry. I feel awful. Notice what happened. You turned a healthy boundary into a sin. And that trains the other person to see your boundary as an offense. Over time, you can no longer say no without punishing yourself. And a person who can't say no without guilt ends up living a life they didn't choose. Another example, you disagreed with someone. You didn't attack, didn't humiliate, just disagreed. And you feel that urge to soften it. Sorry, it's just that I think differently. Maybe I'm wrong. My bad. In some contexts, that can just be politeness. But when it becomes a habit, it becomes self-erasure. Because disagreeing isn't hurting. Disagreeing is being human. And a mature relationship needs to tolerate difference without demanding penance. There's also apologizing for legitimate emotions. You feel sad, tired, overwhelmed, and instead of recognizing that as part of life, you apologize. Sorry for being like this. If you dumped your sadness on someone aggressively, yes, repair is needed. But if you're just being human, that doesn't require guilt. What it requires is care. When you apologize for feeling, you start treating your own emotion as an inconvenience. And that creates a cruel internal relationship. You become a censor of your own humanity. And here Jung comes in very clearly. When you repress what you feel to maintain the image of easygoing person, you push content into the shadow. And the shadow doesn't disappear. It returns. It returns as unexpected outbursts, sarcasm, detachment, or choices that sabotage connections. The person spends years being understanding to a fault and then suddenly ends things harshly. Not because they became mean, but because they accumulated a lifetime of tiny internal betrayals. The apology used to buy peace is one of the bricks in that construction. So how do you act maturely without becoming rude? It starts with a short pause before sorry. A 2-second pause already changes everything. In that pause, you ask yourself, did I actually cause harm or am I just afraid of the discomfort? If you caused harm, repair it. If you're afraid of discomfort, breathe and hold the line. Holding discomfort is one of the most important adult skills. Because not all tension needs to be erased. Some tension needs to be walked through with clarity. A practical alternative is to replace sorry with expressions of respect that don't carry guilt. Instead of sorry for not replying, you can say thanks for waiting. Instead of sorry I can't, you can say I won't be able to make it, but thanks for the invite. Instead of sorry for disagreeing, you can say I see it differently and I can explain if you want. That keeps the politeness without turning you into the guilty party. Another point, don't over-explain. Excessive explanation is often disguised permission-seeking. The person doesn't just say I can't. They build an entire courtroom to justify it, and that weakens the boundary. The more you justify, the more room you leave for negotiation. A healthy boundary is simple, clear, repeatable. And if the other person insists, you repeat calmly. Calmness is what shows you're not attacking. You're just respecting yourself. It's also important to accept an uncomfortable truth. Some people will react badly when you stop apologizing for no reason. They may call you cold, selfish, distant. That's the test. Because if you go back to the old habit to regain approval, you confirm the old rule. I'm only accepted when I make myself smaller. Holding firmness without aggression is the birth of freedom. And here, human philosophy asks a grounding question. Do you want to be loved for who you are, or tolerated for who you pretend to be? Because when you apologize constantly to avoid discomfort, you offer a domesticated version of yourself. That version may be accepted, but it's not you. And when acceptance comes for the mask, the soul stays hungry. Apologizing when necessary is a virtue. But apologizing to erase your presence is self-abandonment. Maturity learns to repair real mistakes without turning your own existence into a mistake. And that change isn't loud. It starts with small phrases, small pauses, small no's, held with serenity. There's a decisive moment in adult life when you notice something uncomfortable. Many relationships don't fall apart because you were unfair. They fall apart because you stopped being convenient. And it's exactly at that point that the impulse to apologize appears strongest. You say no, and immediately feel the need to soften, compensate, explain, shrink. As if setting a boundary were aggression. As if taking care of your own time were a sin. As if protecting your body and mind were a lack of love. But a boundary isn't a lack of love. A boundary is love with a spine. When human philosophy leaves the pretty phrases and enters real life, it shows that self-respect doesn't come from grand speeches. It comes from the way you manage everyday life, the way you protect your rest, the way you choose who you talk to, the way you respond to requests that drain your energy, the way you decide what enters and what doesn't enter your life. And here's the hard part. When you start doing this seriously, some people will react as if you're doing something wrong, and that's when guilt tries to take the wheel. Stoicism helps a lot in those moments because it makes a simple, brutal distinction. You have duties, but you don't have an obligation to self-destruct to meet expectations. There's a difference between being useful and being exploitable. A mature person helps when they can and when it makes sense, but they don't sacrifice their own integrity to maintain the image of good. Because kindness that costs your mental health isn't virtue, it's compulsion. And compulsion doesn't build a dignified life, it just builds an exhausted one. Let's bring this to concrete situations. There are people who treat your time like it belongs to them. They want immediate answers. They want total availability. They want you always ready, always attentive, always present, as if your life were an extension of theirs. And when you don't deliver, they get offended. Not because you hurt them, but because you didn't obey. If you apologize every time you can't meet that urgency, you train a pattern. Your life becomes subordinated to someone else's rhythm. You shouldn't apologize for not replying right away when there was no clear agreement about urgency. You can be polite, acknowledge the message, explain briefly if you want. But turning your autonomy into guilt is the beginning of a modern form of servitude, emotional servitude. The person lives with their phone like a leash and their mind like a guard. And deep down, life gets smaller. Another scenario, self-care. The person wants to rest, but apologizes for resting. Wants to be silent, but apologizes for being silent. Wants to skip a social event because they're out of energy and says, "Forgive me, I'm a problem." Notice the hidden poison there. The body becomes guilt. The need becomes a flaw. The boundary becomes shame. That's a form of internal violence. You start treating yourself like an inconvenience. And when you treat yourself that way, the world learns to treat you the same. Jung would say there's a part of us that seeks approval to avoid facing our own emptiness. When you don't rest, you stay busy and avoid hearing certain questions. When you're always available, you avoid dealing with the fact that some relationships only exist because you sustain them. When you apologize for taking care of yourself, you keep the fantasy that your worth lies in serving. And that fantasy is comfortable in the short term because it gives identity. I'm the one who fixes things. But in the long run, it comes at a high price. You burn out, and when you can no longer serve, you feel like you've lost the right to exist. There's also the issue of emotional boundaries. You shouldn't apologize for not accepting disrespect. Here, human philosophy needs to be direct. Tolerating what hurts isn't nobility. It can be fear of being alone. It can be a childhood habit. It can be hope that if you endure a little longer, the other person will change. But enduring the intolerable doesn't make you virtuous. It makes you vulnerable to repeated abuse. And repetition creates moral anesthesia. You start thinking what's absurd is normal. You can, yes, apologize if you raised your voice, humiliated someone, were cruel. That's responsibility. But you shouldn't apologize for saying, "I don't accept that tone. I'm not continuing this conversation like this. I'm going to step away." Leaving a degrading situation calmly is an act of maturity. And maturity doesn't need to apologize for existing. Another delicate point. You shouldn't apologize for having priorities. Mature people have multiple responsibilities: work, family, health, rest, inner life. Not everything can be attended to. When you choose one priority, someone will inevitably feel overlooked. And here comes an emotional trap, thinking every frustration the other person feels is your fault. It isn't. Sometimes it's just reality. You're human. Your time is finite. Your body has limits. If you apologize every time you choose a priority, you start living trying to fit the infinite into the finite. That's an impossible project. Stoic philosophy calls this living against nature. Nature here isn't romanticism, it's fact. You have limited energy, and a good life is, in part, the art of directing that energy wisely. The person who tries to please everyone lives in permanent debt. The person who chooses clearly lives with more peace. And there's an even deeper aspect: you shouldn't apologize for changing. Change bothers those who benefited from your old version. When you mature, you start seeing patterns, start refusing manipulations, start speaking more directly. Some will say you're not the same anymore. And sometimes that's true, and it's good news. Because being the same, for many people, meant continuing to repeat self-abandonment. Jung would say that the process of becoming more whole necessarily breaks certain old alliances. Alliances with guilt, with fear, with the role of savior, with the mask of good. And when you break them, anxiety appears. Anxiety demands an old gesture. Apologize, go back to the known place, recover affection quickly. But the price is high. You return to prison. So how do you act without becoming cold? The difference lies in tone and intention. You can be firm and kind. You can say no with respect. You can refuse without humiliating. You can protect your time without despising the other person. Mature firmness isn't aggressive, it's clear. and clarity is often the greatest act of respect. Because a false yes, given out of guilt, turns into resentment. An honest no, given calmly, preserves truth. A useful practice is to simplify your language. Instead of, "Sorry, I feel awful, I'm horrible for not going," you say, "I can't make it today. I need to rest." Period. If you want, you can add a gesture of consideration. "Thanks for the invite." But without punishing yourself, without shrinking, without turning self-care into a crime. Another practice. When guilt comes, investigate where it's coming from. Is it from a real mistake or from conditioning? If it's from a real mistake, repair it. If it's from conditioning, hold the discomfort and don't betray yourself. Because in the beginning, self-respect hurts a little. It hurts because you're unlearning an old way of surviving. But that hurt is different. It's the discomfort of growing, not the pain of losing yourself. And there's a question that can save you in decisive moments. If I apologize now, am I being responsible or am I erasing myself? That question is a sharp blade. It cuts through confusion, and over time, you realize many apologies were just attempts to keep the other person calm at the cost of your peace. Boundaries, time, and self-care are not offenses. They're the foundations of a dignified life. A person who needs you to apologize for resting, for saying no, for taking care of your health, probably doesn't want your happiness. They want your availability. And honest human philosophy says availability without dignity becomes servitude. In the end, apologizing isn't the problem. The problem is when apologizing becomes a crutch to hold up a life you can no longer carry. Because there's a brutal difference between acknowledging a mistake and shrinking to be accepted. Acknowledging a mistake strengthens conscience. Shrinking weakens the soul. And that's why so many people live tired without understanding. It's not just the routine, not just the bills, not just time passing. It's the daily repetition of tiny internal surrenders, as if every automatic sorry were a silent signature saying, "I don't deserve to take up my own space." Adult life requires a skill no one teaches properly, the art of staying kind without handing over your dignity. Some learn to be firm but become aggressive. Others learn to be polite but become submissive. Maturity lies in the middle, in a place that doesn't make a spectacle. You can be courteous without apologizing for existing. You can take responsibility without destroying yourself. You can be human without humiliating yourself. And that place doesn't come from a grand speech, it comes from practice. Practice of silence, practice of pause, practice of bearing the discomfort of not pleasing. It's common, especially after many years of trying to keep everything under social control, to confuse tension with guilt. The atmosphere gets tense and you think, "It was me." Someone changes their tone and you think, "I owe something." A sideways look and you think, "I messed up." But not all tension is guilt. Sometimes it's just reality adjusting to the fact that you're no longer going to shrink to make other people's lives easier. Sometimes it's the other person dealing with the frustration of no longer having unrestricted access to your time, your energy, your silence, your easy yes. And that may feel harsh, but it's liberating. Other people's frustration isn't automatically your debt. When you start walking this road, your conscience becomes clearer. You begin to see more clearly when an apology is an act of character and when it's a conditioned reflex. An act of character is objective. You hurt, you acknowledge, you repair. A conditioned reflex is foggy. You don't know what you did, but you already place yourself below. And the more you repeat that reflex, the more you teach the people around you that your presence is negotiable and your boundary is debatable. Over time, they may not even realize it consciously, but they learn to push. They learn that you back down. They learn that if they stay silent, you explain yourself. They learn that if they get offended, you take the blame. The way out isn't to become insensitive. The way out is to become whole. Integrity is when you don't use guilt as a currency for coexistence. It's when you don't apologize to buy peace. It's when you don't turn a healthy boundary into a crime. It's when you don't apologize for needing time, for needing rest, for needing silence. It's when you don't apologize for disagreeing respectfully, for having an opinion, for not seeing life through someone else's eyes. It's when you don't apologize for feeling legitimately, sadness, tiredness, overload, as if your humanity were an inconvenience. It's when you don't apologize for changing, for growing, for no longer being easy, for abandoning a role that was making you sick. And it's also when you don't apologize for not meeting unrealistic expectations others placed on you without any fair agreement. Notice how all of this meets at the same point, the center of moral life. A moral life isn't a life of perfection. It's a life of uprightness. And uprightness doesn't go with chronic self-abandonment. Stoicism would call this temperance and courage. Temperance to not dissolve into guilt. Courage to hold what's right even when someone doesn't like it. And that courage is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't need to win arguments. It just stands. There's one detail that helps organize everything: the difference between respect and fear. Respect makes you speak with consideration, apologize when you're wrong, acknowledge other people's boundaries, be gentle. Fear makes you apologize when you didn't do anything wrong, accept disrespect to avoid rejection, over-explain, give in too much, stay too small. If you learn to notice that difference in your body, the rush in your chest, the need to appease, the impulse to justify, you start to take back the government of yourself. And governing yourself isn't rigidity, it's sobriety. You choose your words the way someone chooses their direction. Maybe from now on a simple gesture is enough to change the day. Before apologizing, silently ask if there's real harm to repair. If there is, repair it with dignity and simplicity. If there isn't, trade guilt for clarity. Instead of sorry, you can offer something more honest. A thanks for understanding. I appreciate your patience. I won't be able to. I need to rest. I see it differently. That keeps civility without sacrificing your inner spine. And when guilt comes, because it usually does in the beginning, treat it like an old habit that's lost its usefulness. Not as an enemy, but as a signal. A signal that you're leaving an old survival mode. Anyone who spent years over-adapting feels discomfort when they start respecting themselves. It's almost like wearing new shoes. At first they pinch, then they adjust. Except here the adjustment is of the soul. You're learning to fit into yourself. If there's one sentence that sums it all up, it's this: don't apologize for being fair to yourself. Fairness to yourself isn't selfishness, it's foundation. Without it, you help the world and destroy yourself. Without it, you love and erase yourself. Without it, you work and lose yourself. And a life lost on the inside isn't worth the approval on the outside. Of course, there will be moments when you get the balance wrong. Sometimes you'll be too firm, sometimes you'll over-explain. That's part of it. Maturity isn't always getting it right, it's correcting faster. It's noticing the pattern and calmly returning to center. And that center is simple. Responsibility when there's a mistake, firmness when there's a boundary, kindness without submission, truth without cruelty. If you made it this far, I want to suggest a quiet exercise for the next few days. Notice how many times you apologize for things that aren't offenses. Notice where you shrink to make things easier. Notice where you punish yourself to keep the other person comfortable. And then make a small, almost invisible swap. Instead of the automatic apology, choose a phrase that preserves respect and preserves you. You'll see that the world doesn't collapse. And if someone gets uncomfortable, maybe it's just the sound of your self-respect taking up space. If this video helped you see something that's been happening for a long time, drop a like to support the channel. Write in the comments which situation you most often catch yourself apologizing for no reason. It can open valuable reflections for other people too. Share it with someone who keeps making themselves smaller to be accepted. And subscribe to the channel to keep going deeper into this kind of practical wisdom that isn't here to impress anyone, but to return peace to the right place, inside you.